The day he said it out loud. There are words that stay with you, not because they were kind, not because they gave you strength, but because they were said by the one person in the world who was supposed to believe in you more than anyone else. My father looked me in the eye, his own daughter, and said 4 words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. You are worth nothing. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it in a moment of rage he later regretted. He said it clearly, calmly, at the dinner table, in front of my mother, my brother, and 2 of his closest friends. He said it like it was just a fact, like he was reading the weather, like saying it out loud didn't cost him a single thing. And the room went quiet. My mother looked down at her plate. My brother shifted in his chair. His friends said nothing. And I sat there, 26 years old, hands in my lap, and I made myself a silent promise. Not a promise made in anger, not in tears, but in the deep, cold, clear place that only opens up inside you when someone breaks your heart so completely that something new grows in its place. I promised myself that one day he would understand exactly what I was worth. This is that story. A house with no room for me. My name is Clara, and I want to start at the beginning, not the dramatic beginning, not the night everything changed, but the real beginning, because if you don't understand where I came from, you won't fully understand what I built, or why handing my father that deed meant everything. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio. My father, Richard, was what people in our neighborhood called a self-made man. He had built a small construction company from the ground up, starting with a single truck and 2 employees when he was 24 years old. By the time I was born, he had 40 employees and a reputation for being the toughest, most demanding boss in the county. People respected him, or at least, they acted like they did. At home, the rules were different. My brother Daniel was 3 years older than me, and from the very beginning, from as far back as I can remember, Daniel was the one who mattered. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because it was simply true, the way the sky is blue or water runs downhill. It wasn't something that happened dramatically. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 small moments, stacked on top of each other, one after another, year after year. Daniel got the new bicycle. I got Daniel's old one when the chain was already rusted. Daniel's school plays were attended by both parents. My school performances, twice I had the lead, were attended by my mother alone because Dad had a work thing. Daniel's college fund started when he was 5. I found out at 17 that mine had never been opened. You'll get married, my father said when I asked about it, not looking up from his newspaper. You don't need a degree for that. I was 17 years old. I cried that night in my room, quietly, with a pillow pressed to my face. Not because I was weak, but because a part of me had still been hoping that maybe I had misread things. Maybe the bicycle was a coincidence. Maybe the school plays were just scheduling. Maybe there was a college fund somewhere that I just didn't know about. There wasn't. By 18, I understood the architecture of my family perfectly. My father had built a house, a real one, a beautiful one with 4 bedrooms and a wraparound porch. And in that house there was a room for his legacy, and a room for his heir, and a room for his wife, and somewhere near the back, a small spare room that nobody had quite decided what to do with. That room was me. I graduated high school with honors. Nobody celebrated. I applied to a state university on my own, filled out the financial aid forms myself, was accepted, and told my parents at dinner. My father looked up from his plate, said good, and went back to eating. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. That squeeze was the most encouragement I received from my family that day. But I want to tell you something. I want you to hear this clearly because it matters. I was not broken. I was not destroyed. I was paying attention. Learning the language of worth. I put myself through college. I worked 2 jobs my first year. A morning shift at a campus coffee shop starting at 5:30 in the morning, and a weekend shift at a grocery store that kept me on my feet for 8 hours straight. I ate a lot of rice and pasta. I wore the same 3 sweaters all winter. I called my mother on Sundays and kept the calls short because long-distance minutes cost money, and I was counting every single one. My father called me twice in 4 years. Both times were under 3 minutes. Both times ended with him reminding me not to embarrass the family. But here is what I also did in those 4 years. I studied. Not just my coursework, though I graduated with a 3.8 GPA in business administration. I studied people. I studied how businesses worked. I studied what made something valuable and what made something a waste. I listened in every room I entered. I asked questions that most people my age were too cool to ask. And I found a mentor. Her name was Professor Elaine Marsh. She taught real estate investment and financial strategy, and she had the kind of energy that makes you feel like the world is full of doors you haven't opened yet. She was 61 years old and had built and sold 3 small real estate companies before becoming a professor for fun, as she put it. She saw something in me in the first week of her class. I had raised my hand to answer a question about property valuation, a question nobody else had attempted. And when I was done, she had paused, tilted her head, and said, "Where did you learn that?" "I taught myself," I said. She had looked at me for a long moment. "Stay after class." That conversation lasted 2 hours and changed the direction of my life. Professor Marsh took me under her wing in the way that only the truly generous can, not by giving me shortcuts, but by showing me the long road more clearly. She connected me with a small real estate investment firm for a summer internship after my junior year. She wrote me recommendation letters that opened doors I hadn't even known existed. And in my final semester, she sat me down in her office and said something I have thought about nearly every day since. "Clara, the people who told you that you weren't worth much, they were telling you about their own limits, not yours. Don't carry their ceiling as if it's your floor." I wrote that down. I still have it. I graduated on a Saturday in May. It was sunny. My mother came. She cried. She brought flowers. My father sent a card. Inside, in his handwriting, "Congratulations. Don't waste it." I put the card in a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I kept it as a reminder of the bar I was expected to meet, and how far above it I intended to go. Building something he would never understand. My first job out of college was as a junior analyst at a small real estate firm in Columbus, Ohio. The salary was modest. The hours were long. The learning was extraordinary. I spent 3 years there, absorbing everything. I learned how to read a market. I learned how to identify undervalued properties, the ones sitting in neighborhoods that were about to change, the ones whose owners were tired and motivated to sell, the ones that looked rough on the outside but had good bones underneath. I learned how to negotiate, how to be quiet when quiet served me better than speaking, how to ask the right question at the right moment, how to walk away from a deal even when I wanted it badly, because walking away often brought the other side back to the table at a lower number. And I saved. Every month I put away 30% of my income. I lived small. I didn't buy the things my peers were buying. I didn't take the vacations. I didn't upgrade my apartment until my 3rd year. At 25, I bought my first property. It was a small duplex in a neighborhood that most people had written off. I got it for $68,000. It needed work, new floors, a repainted exterior, updated plumbing in 1 unit. I managed the renovation myself, checking in every day, learning as I went, making mistakes and fixing them. I rented both units within 6 weeks of completion. The cash flow wasn't enormous, but it was real. And more than the money, it was the feeling. The feeling of having built something, of having taken a risk on yourself and been right. 6 months later, I bought a second property, then a third. By 28, I owned 7 properties across 3 neighborhoods in Columbus. I had a property manager handling day-to-day operations. I had refinanced twice, pulling equity out to fund new purchases. I had a small but growing portfolio that was generating consistent monthly income, and I had started something bigger. Using the connections I had built at the firm and the experience I had accumulated, I launched my own company, CMR Properties. It was just me and 1 part-time assistant at first. But I had a clear vision: identify undervalued residential and small commercial properties, Acquire them strategically, renovate where necessary, hold long-term, and build equity. It was not glamorous. There were months where I was genuinely stressed, where a repair bill came in larger than expected, where a tenant stopped paying, and I had to go through the slow, painful legal process. There were moments of doubt at 2 in the morning when I lay awake running numbers in my head and wondering if I had moved too fast. But I kept going, and the portfolio kept growing. By the time I was 31, CMR Properties held 23 units across 6 properties, had a market value of just over $2 million, and was generating enough income that I no longer needed to work for anyone else. I was my own boss. I had built something real, something that had my name on it, and my father still had no idea any of it existed. The night he said it, "I need to tell you about the dinner." It was a Tuesday in November, the year I turned 32. My mother had been asking me to come home for months, not in a dramatic way, just in that quiet, persistent way that mothers have. She would mention it at the end of phone calls. She would bring it up sideways, through stories about neighborhood friends visiting their parents, through references to how long it had been since the last holiday. I went. I told myself it would be fine. I was not the same girl who had sat at that table at 17, devastated by the news about the college fund. I was a grown woman with a business, a portfolio, and the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from having built something with your own hands. I drove the 4 hours to my parents' house. It looked the same, the wraparound porch, the oak tree in the front yard that I had climbed as a child, the shutters my father had painted dark green the summer I was 10. My mother met me at the door. She looked a little older, a little more tired, but her eyes were warm, and she held me for a long moment before ushering me inside. My father was in the living room with my brother Daniel and 2 men I recognized as longtime friends of his, Paul and Garrett, both in construction like him, both men I had known peripherally my entire childhood. "Clara's here," my mother said. My father looked up. "About time." No hello. No how are you. No, I haven't seen you in 8 months and I've been counting. Just about time. I sat down. Dinner was made. The table was set. The conversation flowed the way it always did in that house, around my father, orbiting him, deferring to him. Daniel talked about the promotion he had just gotten at my father's company. He was now operations manager, which meant he was in line to take over one day. My father beamed, literally beamed, a warmth in his face that I recognized the shape of, even though it had never once been directed at me. Someone asked what I was doing these days. I said carefully that I had a real estate company. My father made a sound, a kind of short, quiet exhale through the nose. Not a laugh exactly, more like a dismissal. "Real estate," he said. "Yes," I said. "You buying houses, flipping them, that kind of thing?" "Acquiring and holding residential and commercial properties mostly. Long-term investment." Another pause. Then he said, "How many properties?" "A few," I said. I didn't want to get into it. Not there. Not with Paul and Garrett watching. "A few," he repeated. He looked at Daniel. Something passed between them. A look I recognized from childhood. The private language of approval that I had always been excluded from. Then he turned back to me, and something shifted in his expression. Something flattened. "You know what your problem is, Clara?" he said. "You always thought you were smarter than you are, always had these big ideas, but ideas don't pay bills. Hard work pays bills. Real work, not playing around with properties." I kept my voice steady. "I work hard." "Playing with houses isn't a career," he said. "You don't have a real job. You never have. You coasted through college, you coasted through that little office job, and now you're playing at being a businesswoman." He picked up his fork. "You always were the one who never amounted to much." The table went quiet. My mother looked at her hands. Daniel looked at his plate. Paul and Garrett looked somewhere between uncomfortable and carefully neutral. And my father said, without looking up, "You are worth nothing, Clara. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because someone has to be honest with you. You never made anything of yourself. You never will. That's just the truth." He said it like he was setting down a plate, like it was the most ordinary thing, and I sat very still. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I picked up my glass of water, took one slow sip, set it back down, and I thought, okay, okay. He just made this very simple. What silence can build. I drove home that night in the dark, 4 hours, mostly in silence. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry in the car the way I had expected I might. I just drove, watching the road, the white lines disappearing under my headlights one by one. I thought about Professor Marsh, about what she had said, about ceilings and floors. I thought about the duplex I had bought at 25 for $68,000, about the look on the inspector's face when I had shown up alone at the walkthrough, a young woman with a notepad, and he had tried to explain basic plumbing to me like I was a child, and I had patiently redirected the conversation back to the specific concerns I had identified in the report. I thought about the first time I had closed a commercial property deal, sitting across from a developer twice my age who had tried to pressure me into accepting a lower price, and the moment I had quietly placed my counteroffer on the table and watched him realize I wasn't going to move. I thought about my company, about the 23 units, about the spreadsheets I had built, the systems I had designed, the relationships I had cultivated with lenders and contractors and tenants. And I thought about my father's voice, flat, certain. You are worth nothing. I did not want revenge the way you see it in movies. Loud, dramatic, humiliating. That was never who I was. What I wanted was something quieter, something more final. I wanted him to understand, completely, undeniably, in a way that could not be walked back or explained away, exactly what he had dismissed. And I knew how to do it. I had known for a while, if I was being honest. There was a property I had been watching, a large commercial lot at the edge of town, about 12 miles from my parents' house, adjacent to a new development corridor that had been quietly approved by the county 3 months earlier. The seller was an older man named Howard Gill, who had inherited the land from his father and had no interest in developing it himself. He had been sitting on it for years, not quite knowing what to do with it. I had run the numbers 6 times. I had read the county development reports. I had spoken to 2 contractors about what the build-out would look like. The land was worth approximately $4.2 million based on the projected development and comparable recent sales in the corridor. Howard Gill was asking $900,000. He didn't know what he had. I had been waiting, not because I was unsure, but because the timing hadn't felt right. The financing needed to line up perfectly. The county approvals needed to finalize. On the drive home that night, I made 2 decisions. First, I was going to acquire that property. Second, I was going to make sure my father knew exactly what it was worth. Not to gloat, not to humiliate him in public, but because he needed to look at that deed and understand, in the language he respected most, the language of money, of property, of hard concrete value, what his daughter had built, what his daughter was. I pulled into my driveway at 2 in the morning. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I went inside, made a cup of tea, opened my laptop, and started writing the email to Howard Gill. $900,000 and a quiet conversation. I want to walk you through the acquisition because it matters. It matters because this wasn't a windfall. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a gift from someone. Every single dollar I used to close that deal had been earned, saved, planned for, and deployed with care. The financing structure took 6 weeks to finalize. I used equity from 3 of my existing properties as collateral, brought in a small private investor I had worked with twice before, a woman named Diane who had trusted my judgment on 2 previous deals and made good returns both times, and secured a commercial bridge loan for the balance. The negotiation with Howard Gill took 4 meetings. Howard was a quiet man in his late 60s, a retired school teacher who had inherited the land and genuinely felt uncertain about what to do with it. He liked me, I think. I came prepared, I listened carefully, and I never once tried to rush him. I told him the truth, that I saw a long-term opportunity in the land, that I planned to hold it as part of a development project, and that I was a serious buyer. What I did not tell him was exactly how serious the opportunity was, because that is the nature of any negotiation. I was not deceiving him. He had access to the same county records I had, but he hadn't read them, and I had. That is not unfairness. That is preparation. We closed at $880,000. I signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in March, sitting across from Howard and two attorneys in a conference room with a view of the parking lot. Howard shook my hand afterwards and said he hoped I'd make good use of it. I will, I told him. And I meant it. I walked out of that building holding a folder with the deed inside. I sat in my car for a moment, just breathing. This was the peace. This was the peace I had been building toward. Now I needed to move carefully. Over the following weeks, I began the process of securing development approval for the land, working with an architect on preliminary plans, engaging a commercial contractor, submitting documentation to the county planning office. This was going to take time, 18 months, maybe 2 years before full development was complete. But I already had the appraisal. Based on the county approval, the projected development, and the current comparable market data, a licensed appraiser had placed the property's value at $4.1 million. I had that appraisal in writing. I put it in a folder. I put the deed in the folder. I put the county development approval summary in the folder. And then I called my mother. "Mom," I said, "I'd like to come home. I have something I want to share with the family. Everything in its right place. I want you to understand something about what I was planning. I was not planning a scene. I was not planning an explosion, a confrontation, a shouting match, a public humiliation. That is not who I am. That has never been who I am. What I was planning was a moment of clarity. My father valued certain things above all else: hard work, real results, money, and property. He had built his identity around those things. He judged people, including his own daughter, by those standards. So I was going to meet him on his own terms, not with a speech about how he had hurt me, not with tears or accusations, but with a folder, with numbers, with a deed. I arrived at my parents' house on a Saturday in May, 6 months after the dinner where he had said those words. My mother had made lunch. It was a nice day, warm, the windows open. There was the smell of the lilac bushes my mother had planted along the back fence when I was small. The oak tree in the front yard had leafed out. It looked like home, which of course it both was and wasn't. My father was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in. He looked up. He said, "You're here." "I'm here," I said. Daniel was there too, sitting across from him, coffee in hand. He looked at me with the mild curiosity he had always applied to my life, as though I were a distant news story, something happening somewhere else, not quite real. I set the folder on the table. I did not sit down immediately. I stood for a moment, looking at my father, and I felt nothing dramatic, not rage, not triumph, something quieter, something like the feeling you have when you have carried something heavy for a very long time and you are finally about to set it down. "Dad," I said, "I want to show you something." He looked at the folder, then back at me. "What is it?" "It's a property I acquired in March," I said. I sat down. I opened the folder. I turned the first page toward him. The deed, with my name on it, the property address, the acquisition date. He looked at it. He said nothing. I turned to the next page, the county development approval. He looked at that too. I turned to the last page, the appraisal, the number at the bottom, 41. The kitchen was very quiet. My father stared at the appraisal for a long time, long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming, long enough that a car passed on the street outside. Then he looked up at me, and I said quietly, without any anger, "You told me I was worth nothing." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I kept working, I said. I kept building. This is one property. I have 24 others. Daniel had put down his coffee cup. My mother, standing at the counter, had gone very still. I closed the folder. I left it on the table. I'm not here because I'm angry, I said. I stopped being angry a long time ago. I'm here because you're my father, and I thought you deserved to know. I stood up. I said, I love you, Dad. I always have. And then I picked up my bag, said goodbye to my mother, hugged her for a long moment, and I walked out. It happened after I left. My mother called me that evening. Her voice was careful, the way it gets when she is navigating something delicate, something she wants to say right. She told me that after I left, my father had sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He hadn't said anything. He had just sat there with the folder in front of him. Eventually, Daniel had picked it up and gone through the pages. She could hear him in the kitchen, the sound of paper turning. She said Daniel had gone quiet for a while after that too. Then she told me what my father said. He had looked at the folder for a long time, and then he had said, not to anyone in particular, more to the room. She did all this herself. That was it. That was all he said. My mother was crying a little by then. She tried to hide it, but I could hear it in the edges of her voice. Clara, she said, he's proud of you. He doesn't know how to say it. He never has. Mom, I said gently, it's okay. He's going to call you. He doesn't have to. He wants to. I let a breath go. I know. I'll be here when he does. He called 3 days later. It was a Sunday morning. I was having coffee and reading. My phone buzzed on the counter and I looked at the screen and saw his name, and I just sat with it for a moment before I picked it up. Clara, he said. Dad. A pause. A long one. That property, he said. 4 million. 4.1, I said, based on the current appraisal. Another pause. I didn't know, he said. And his voice had something in it I had never heard before. Something unsteady. I didn't know you were doing all of this. You never asked, I said, gently, without sharpness. He was quiet. I shouldn't have said what I said, he said finally. At Thanksgiving. At dinner. November, I said. It was November. I know, he said. I shouldn't have said it. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, no, you shouldn't have. We stayed on the phone for a while after that. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. No movie music, no tearful embrace. He is who he is. Some people learn to say I'm sorry with their whole chest, and some people can only say it sideways, in pieces, through the gap between what they meant to say and what they managed. But he said it, in his way, and I heard it. What this was really about. I want to stop here, because I think there is something important to say. This story is not really about a deed. It's not really about $4 million. Those things matter. They are real. They represent years of work and discipline and sacrifice. But they are not the point. The point is this. There are people in every family, in every life, who decide, consciously or not, that you are a certain kind of person, that you have a certain kind of ceiling, that you fit in a certain kind of box. And sometimes those people are the ones closest to you, the ones whose voices are loudest in your head at 2 a.m. My father was that person for me. And for a long time, longer than I like to admit, his voice was in my head when I made decisions, when I looked at a new property and thought about whether to take the risk, when I sat across from a negotiator twice my size and twice my age, when I was at my desk at midnight, tired and uncertain, trying to decide if I had gone too far or not far enough. His voice was there. But here is what I learned. You can carry someone's doubt about you without believing it. You can hear it, acknowledge it, feel the weight of it, and still choose to move in the opposite direction. In fact, and I know this sounds strange, the doubt was useful to me. Not because he was right. He wasn't. but because every time I heard his voice telling me I was worth nothing, I felt a quiet, steady fire in my chest. Not rage, not bitterness, just fuel. Just the simple decision to prove one day at a time that he was wrong. Not to him, not first, to myself. That is the secret that nobody tells you about people who build things from nothing. It is rarely pure confidence. It is rarely a person who woke up every morning filled with certainty and ease. More often, it is someone who woke up with doubt, with fear, with voices in their head telling them they weren't enough, and who got up anyway, who sat down at the desk anyway, who made the call anyway, who signed the papers anyway. That was me. That is me. 4 properties became 30. The development on the acquired land took 22 months from the time I signed the deed to the time the first tenants moved into the mixed-use commercial space I had built on the site. By then, CMR Properties had grown further. I had brought on a full-time property manager, a part-time financial analyst, and an operations coordinator. We had 30 properties, a mix of residential and small commercial. The portfolio's market value had crossed $8 million. I had been approached twice by larger investment groups wanting to acquire my company. Both times, I declined. Not because I needed to hold on, but because I wasn't done yet. I had a vision that was still unfolding, an expansion into 2 neighboring markets, a refinancing strategy that would allow me to double the portfolio over the next 3 years without taking on disproportionate debt. A mentorship fund I had set up quietly in Professor Marsh's name to support first-generation college students in business programs. I was building. I was still building. And every day that I sat at my desk and looked at the numbers and watched the portfolio grow, I thought about something Professor Marsh had said once. She had said, "The most powerful thing you can do is become undeniable. Not loud, not flashy, not dramatic. Undeniable." That was the word I had lived by. That was what I had built. A life so clearly, so completely real, that there was nothing left to argue with. No amount of dismissal, no amount of, "you were never worth much." None of it could stand in the same room as what I had built. Not because I was trying to win an argument, but because the argument had simply ceased to exist. When I handed my father that deed, I wasn't handing him a trophy. I was handing him evidence. Evidence that the girl he had written off, the girl he had failed to fund for college, the girl he had ignored at every school performance and dismissed at every dinner, had been quietly, steadily, patiently building a reality that did not require his permission to exist. That is what the deed was. That is what $4 million was. It was not a weapon. It was a door, swung open, saying, "Look, look what you missed. Look what was always here." Something slowly rebuilt. I want to be honest with you about what happened next with my father. It did not become a perfect relationship. He did not become a different man overnight, or even over years. He is still Richard. He is still the man who built his life around a certain kind of strength and a certain kind of pride, and that pride does not bend easily or completely. But things changed, slowly, in the way that things change when people are tired of the distance between them and someone finally builds a small bridge. He started asking about my work. Not often, maybe once a month on the phone, but he would ask. He would ask about specific properties, about how the commercial development was going, about the financing structures I was using. And sometimes when I explained something to him, I could hear something in his voice that I had spent my whole life listening for. Respect. Not the full-throated, arms-wide kind that I had watched him give Daniel so easily for so many years, but something real, something earned, not from me earning it, but from him finally seeing what had always been there. He came to see the commercial property once. I took him on a tour myself. I showed him the building I had developed on the land I had bought from Howard Gill. I showed him the tenant spaces, the parking, the infrastructure. He walked through it slowly, looking at everything carefully, the way a builder looks at things, with his eyes on the joists, the corners, the quality of the finishes. When we got outside, he stood in the parking lot in the afternoon sun and looked at the building. "Good work," he said. 2 words. But from him, in that moment, those 2 words were the length of a letter. I said, "Thank you, Dad." And we stood there for a minute in the parking lot, the 2 of us, not saying much else. Just 2 people who had spent too many years talking past each other, standing in the physical proof that at least one of them had gotten something very right. It wasn't forgiveness in the cinematic sense, the big hug, the apology that wipes out decades of hurt. But it was something. It was a beginning of something. And I decided that a beginning was enough. The lesson in the deed. I've been thinking about why I wanted to tell this story. It's not because I want you to admire me. It's not a success story meant to make you feel like you should go out and build a real estate empire. Most people have different paths, different strengths, different seasons. I wanted to tell it because of the people out there who have heard a version of what my father said to me. Maybe it wasn't those exact words. Maybe it was, "You're not smart enough, not talented enough, not the right kind of person, too sensitive, too much, too little." Maybe it was said at a dinner table. Maybe it was never said out loud, but was communicated every day in 100 quiet ways. In who got chosen and who got overlooked, in whose dreams were encouraged and whose were gently, persistently, suffocatingly discouraged. If that's you, this is what I want to say. The people who told you those things were not reading your future. They were reporting their own fears, their own limitations, their own inability to see past the box they had decided to put you in. And here's the truth. You do not need their belief to build your life. You need yours. You need to find the Professor Marsh in your life, the person who looks at you and sees not who you have been told to be, but who you are actually capable of becoming. And if you can't find that person right away, you need to be that person for yourself. You need to get up every morning and choose, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of the deep, clear knowledge that you have something to contribute to this world, that nobody else can contribute in exactly the way you can. And you need to build it. Quietly, if that's your way. Steadily. One decision at a time. One day at a time. Not for the moment when you get to hand someone a deed and watch their face change. Though if that moment comes, it is genuinely very satisfying. But for the life you will have built by the time you get there. That life is yours. Nobody else decided it. Nobody else made it. You did. And nobody can take that away. One last thing. There is one more thing I want to tell you. A year after I handed my father that deed, I was sitting in my office going through contracts when my phone rang. It was Daniel. We didn't talk often. Not because of hostility. The years had softened most of that. But because we had simply built lives that didn't intersect much. He was still at my father's company. He was good at it. He had a wife and 2 kids and a house with a large yard in the suburb where we grew up. He said, "Hey, Clara." "Hey, Daniel." A pause. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Okay." I never said anything. At that dinner, when Dad said what he said. His voice was careful. I just sat there. I was quiet for a moment. I know. I should have said something. "Yes," I said. "You should have." Another pause. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the most uncomplicated apology I had ever received from a member of my family. No explanation, no defense, no qualification. Just, "I should have done better. I'm sorry." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. We talked for a while after that, about his kids, about a project he was working on at the company, about nothing important and everything real. When we hung up, I sat for a moment in my chair, looking out the window of my office at the city. I thought about the girl who had sat at the kitchen table at 17, quietly devastated, making a silent promise to herself. I thought about the drive back from that dinner in November, the dark highway, the white lines disappearing. I thought about Howard Gill's handshake, about the appraisal, about the folder on the kitchen table, and I thought, "You did it, Clara. Not perfectly, Not without cost. Not without the long years of doubt and the 2 in the morning spreadsheets and the moments of genuine fear. But you did it. You became undeniable. And the most beautiful thing about that? Nobody gave it to you. To everyone still building. This is a story about a daughter, about a father, about the space between what we're told we are and what we actually become. But really, it's a story about you, about anyone who was ever told they weren't enough, anyone who sat at a table and heard their worth dismissed like a footnote, anyone who drove home in the dark, quietly deciding that they were going to prove something, not to the person who hurt them, but to themselves, first and most importantly. If you're in the middle of that journey right now, if you're in the years before the deed, before the folder, before the moment where everything you built becomes visible and undeniable, I want you to hear this. Keep going. Not because the destination is guaranteed. Life doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But because the building is the point, the becoming is the point. The person you are growing into, one decision at a time, one day at a time, one quiet choice to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. That person is the point, and that person is worth everything.